Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 7. Week 7 is the week before week 8, which is the end of the course. So we're hitting the home stretch. And by May 10th, your second exam, your final exam, which includes 20 multiple choice questions, 2 short answer questions, short answer meaning basically a paragraph, or is it one? I can't remember. It's one, excuse me, one short answer question, and 2 fill in the blank questions, totaling 300 points, which means your multiple choice questions are worth 20 points apiece. Your And the other proportions regarding the short answer question and the 2 fill in the blank questions are there on the exam as well. It's untimed, it's downloadable. Just put your name on it like you did with your midterm exam and take your time in completing it. Don't try to rush it like you did with the last one, because some people basically 300s, right? So you want to get as close to 300 as possible. And I'm trying to make sure you do that. So um, I think um, the short answer question is worth 50 or 60 points, and I think the last 2 are worth 20 or 25 points each. I can't recall. Just look at the proportions. It's on the exam. I did this like 3 months ago. So anyway, so there's that. All of you have been doing anywhere between pretty well and excellently, expertly even on your discussions. So I don't really have anything to say about that. Just keep doing what you're doing. Um, so so I just really want to spend time dealing with this week. So week 7 is the second half of the civil rights movement. Courses tend to um, treat this period of time with such sacredness around African American history that we spend a lot of time talking about the civil rights movement period, capital C, capital R, capital M, between roughly 1954 all the way up into the early 70s. Some people believe the civil rights era doesn't even really end until about 1975, which is when I turned 6 years old, by the way, which is another way of saying, as a Gen Xer, really, it went on that long in terms of an official movement. Most people stopped the movement right around anywhere between 1968 and 1972, either with the assassination of Martin Luther King or with the Gary, Indiana meeting about black independent voting, or the election of Shirley Chisholm or Barbara Jordan to office in 1972 and 76. I mean, it depends on how you want to do it, but in any case, it doesn't end in 1964-65. And so the main theme around this week, at least as far as your readings are concerned, at least as far as the powers that be at UMGC are concerned, is the sharp, distinctive contrast, the 180 between the peace-loving nonviolence of the traditional civil rights movement and the violence advocated by Black Panther Party, the Black Power movement, that's in which the Panther Party is a small part, and the Nation of Islam as espoused by people like Malcolm X, right? And I'm here to tell you that that's a crock. That's just I have grown to hate this sort of characterization of this part of the civil rights movement. Um, it's BS. It's poppycock. It's balderdash. It's all the words that I want to say, but you know I can't, right? So the closest thing I can say to it is that it's a bunch of BS. And here's why. Um, if anyone paid any attention to what Malcolm X was saying, if anyone paid any attention to Black Panther Party was actually saying, if anyone paid any actual attention to even what Martin Luther King was saying, the idea that there's this huge contrast is ridiculous, right? And the evidence is clear. Martin Luther King, you know, was completely about Gandhi's concept of nonviolent protest to try to get what you needed in terms of civil and human rights, right? Basic civil and human rights, no more rights than any other American citizen would be entitled to, right? He was ultimately assassinated. So to say that violence begets violence when someone who's dedicated his life to nonviolence still gets a bullet put through his brain and through his heart, are you kidding me? Right? So if the idea is that violence begets violence, Malcolm X personally wasn't violent toward anyone during his time as the mouthpiece for the minister and the minister for the Nation of Islam, right? I don't recall him getting in any fights. I don't recall him beating people up. I don't recall him even slapping someone down in self-defense during his time as, minister in the Nation of Islam, right? Okay, so why did he deserve to get assassinated, right? As part of what might have been an FBI move through various entities, including reaching out to a splinter group within the Nation of Islam to have this man killed because they had too much influence over the thinking of too many African American folk, right? So when you think about the Black Power movement, when you think about Black Panther Party, you think about Malcolm X and them talking about self-defense. They're not saying that they want to go out and shoot people. There's nothing in what they're saying that says, hey, let's go shoot people, right? Let's go stab and kill and slaughter as many people as possible. No, what they're saying is, and what they're acknowledging is that America is an extremely violent society, that there's always been violence in this society perpetrated against marginalized people, not just black folk. Indigenous Americans have a lot to say, probably a lot more than African Americans to say, about the level of violence that they have faced towards settler colonialism, imperialism, colonialism, and capitalist interests over the course of their time dealing with people of European descent and American people in general, including Buffalo Soldiers who were black, obviously, um, throughout their time of dealing with outsiders. During the last 500 or so years, right? So they have quite a bit to say about this too. All they fairly acknowledge is that we live in an extremely violent society where the first and last weapon of defense against any movement is usually violence. Birmingham, Alabama, Selma, Alabama, 1965. What happened to John Lewis and other people. Um, you know, the, the the three voter workers, people trying to register people to vote, the two Jewish kids from New York, two young Jewish men, let's be honest, because they were college age, and one black guy from the north, all killed and buried in a car in a swamp in the middle of Mississippi for trying to register black folks to vote, right? During Freedom Summer of 1964, right? It's depicted in the movie Mississippi Burning, among other things, right? So this is a violent society. The assassination of Medgar Evers, the assassination of JFK, the assassination of RFK, all of that's happening in the 1960s. So all they're really doing is acknowledging the fact that we live in a violent society, and that if you are going to continue with the idea that nonviolent protest is what leads to lasting change in American society, they're saying no, it does not. For all the successes, the symbolic and maybe even actual successes of the civil rights movement in the 1954 to 65 period, the reality is that most schools were just as segregated in 1965 as they were in 1954 in the South. The reality is that outside of really, I mean, even mind-boggling basic things like water fountains, riding the same bus, taking the same train, that kind of thing. Not the Loving v. Virginia decision, which legally allowed white and black people to get married to each other, um, isn't for another 2 years when the Black Panther Party kicks off and when the Black Power movement kicks off. And it's 2 years after Malcolm X is gunned down that happens. And that's really basic stuff. People just marrying each other, right? Whether for the right or wrong reasons. So the truth in the matter is that, you know, and by the way, this is not just me espousing an opinion. This is based on lots and lots of research. This is based on other writings from everybody from David Levering Lewis to um, Gerald Early to Peniel. I've forgotten his last name. There's so many authors who've looked at the black radical tradition in the 1960s. Michael Eric Dyson's another one. Peniel Joseph is another one. There's so many folks who've written on this topic over the last, say, 30 or 35 years and have come to the conclusion that the media trope of trying to put Malcolm X against Martin Luther King is exactly that. It's a trope because look at their words, you look at their deeds, you look at their actions. The truth in the matter is that there is a definitive difference, but the difference is not so stark that that Martin Luther King is going to go, and you don't have the right to defend yourself. Right? We're not talking about people spitting on you or throwing bottles at you. We're talking about people who are trying to kill you, right? And if they're trying to kill you, you do have a right to self-defense, right? So that part and the violence that the late 60s sparked is really it's really telling when you see articles that basically say there's no real reason to have violence and that nonviolence and civil rights movement work. It worked for a time. That's the thing you have to understand. That's the most important thing you have to understand if you want to move forward and understand why things haven't changed that much from the 1960s to 2022, right? Is that TV was a new medium. The Cold War was a unique period in U.S. history and in world history, and apparently we're not going to go back to that again, no matter what that Vladimir Putin's doing in Ukraine right now, because we're not prepared to send U.S. forces to directly confront Russian forces because, I don't know, nuclear weapons might be involved, right? Kind of thing. And so once people get used to seeing stuff like that on TV, guess what happens? They get desensitized, just like we're just completely desensitized about all the mass shootings that take place in this country, year after year after year, week after week after week. If if the shootings in 2012 are all the 20 kids and 6 adults got killed in 2012 in New York, you know, from a gunman with an AR-15, then it pushed Congress and it pushed people to say, we need to do something about the Second Amendment. We need to do something for gun control. Then guess what? We're not going to change all of those things because, this is a violent society. And if this is a violent society, then the reality is violence does beget violence. So if you are dealing with police brutality in Watts, and police brutality in Cleveland, and police brutality in Washington, D.C., and police brutality in white vigilantism in Pittsburgh, in Chicago, and any number of 120 major cities across this country. And then you find out that your leader, who believes fully in nonviolence as a way to change the world, gets gunned down at a hotel in Memphis, Tennessee around 6 o'clock p.m. during twilight on April 4th, 1968, then you might riot. You might have an uprising. You might go after those cops who have been patrolling your neighborhood and on the south side of Chicago or in Bronzeville or in on U Street in Shaw and Adams Morgan and Columbia Heights or in Harlem or in East Cleveland or other major black neighborhoods across the United States and start going after those people. You might start burning down all the liquor stores because you don't want them there anymore because they're exploiting the poverty and the depression that exists in these communities. You might do those things. Those aren't race riots, by the way. They're riots against racism, to be sure, but you know why they're not race riots? Because those people didn't pick up bats and broomsticks and batons and guns and other things and marched away into predominantly white communities. They didn't march into the Wrigley community around Wrigley Field in Chicago. They didn't march into, you know, the Beverly Hills and other parts of LA. Folks didn't march around here in DC to Georgetown and Cleveland Heights and other places that were predominantly white and try to burn those people out. Can't call it a race riot. It's a riot against racism, to be sure, which is what makes it both an uprising and a riot. But it's not a race riot because the riot's not about going after people who are different than you. You're going after the fact that this whiteness is killing you, right? And so I feel like I say this to students, and students just write what they want, and they're just like, well, Malcolm X is different from Martin Luther King because Malcolm X believed in violence. BS. And it's not true. It's just not true. Self-defense does not mean that you automatically are a violent person. And being deliberately nonviolent all the time doesn't necessarily change your world, right? You know, the fact of the matter is that when has any revolution, when has any movement to basically restore the fullness of humanity of an entire group of marginalized people ever purely worked on the basis of nonviolence? Purely. I could spend the rest of this video just waiting for an answer, but I can guarantee you your answer is not going to be very long. There are not a lot of nonviolent revolutions in world history. Some people would say Christianity is a nonviolent revolution. Well, that's a bunch of BS because, yes, maybe when Jesus was actually on the ground in the first century CE, that's true. But I would say over the course of the next 300 or so years, there was a lot of violence, mostly against Christians. And then there was violence to basically spread Christianity too. So I'm kind of like, I'll wait, right? And I'll wait off camera because I don't think any one of you is going to come up with a definitive answer to this question because some violence has to be involved. In fact, the violence of of all the rioting and all the uprisings that happened after the death of Martin Luther King in 1968 is one of the reasons why the government finally started to do more substantial work in terms of putting more teeth in the laws, like the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1968 was amended specifically for that purpose. While you saw more foundation money, private foundation money, and community development corporations start to populate predominantly black communities across the country, was because hey, we got to figure out how to help these folks because they might decide to riot again. And this time they might decide not to just riot in their own communities, their communities in which they live, which they don't even feel like belong to them. They might decide to march violently, right? Because that's how revolutions start, right? So I'm saying all that to say this, right? Do not define the civil rights era purely in terms of these tropes. This trope of nonviolence on one side, and this whole other group, whether it's the Black Panthers, who, by the way, are the reason why we have free breakfast and free lunch programs in pretty much any school in the United States now. All of it's based on their work, right? Free health care, health clinics, you know, you know, all kinds of other things around Black is beautiful. All of that comes out of the Black Power movement and particularly the Black Panther Party. For all of their contradictions, for all of the so-called violence that they perpetrated, whether you're talking about Huey P. Newton and his drug addictions and his actual violence as an individual, or the violence that was done to them through the COINTEL program of the FBI and through informants who were hired to basically infiltrate meetings and stir the pot, sometimes violently, in places like Chicago and Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C., and in New York, and all across this country. Bottom line is, the violence of our society is the reason why these movements had violence. It's not that these individuals, as in themselves, decided that violence is the way to go. And so, I really do not want to see I don't want to see any really posts that say, well, this one group was violent, or this individual was violent, or this movement was violent, or this is a contrast to Martin Luther King, who believed purely in nonviolence. Even Martin Luther King acknowledged in 1967 and 1968 that the methodology of the movement that helped, bring symbolic and somewhat enforceable, actionable victories in the South could not work up north because of the diffuseness of the racism that was up north, because they weren't fighting legal segregation. They were dealing with residential, traditional, de facto segregation. And acknowledge, too, that the country as a whole was so violent that for most moderates, the message of the movement had already gotten muddled for them. So the people we call liberals today, by the way, the term was moderates back then. The term liberal is basically for anybody who's not a neoconservative or a fascist, right? Which is anything from being on the far left to basically just being a moderate, which is what the majority of Americans are, statistically speaking, by the way. So, saying all that, I just want to make sure, because I really don't have the patience at this stage of my life to be reading a lot of, you know, Malcolm X is the polar opposite of Martin Luther King. The Black Panther Party is the polar opposite of everything the civil rights movement stood for, because they're not. They're actually twins, right? Fraternal twins, be sure not identical twins, but they're still twins. They're supporting each other in terms of advancements on university campuses, in black communities and cities are particularly outside of the South, and in so many other ways, shapes, and forms that support what was actually happening in the South. They complement each other, even as there might be some rhetorical contradictions between what they're saying and what they're doing. So please, please do not do the stereotypical thinking about this for this week. Um, I'm probably not even going to comment on those who do that. I guarantee you I won't. I'll probably just give you a score and call it, because I don't have the patience for it. So that's it for this week. We'll talk about the last 50 years or so of African American history in week 8. Yeah, that's a lot. It's a 50-year chunk. And, there are ways of defining it. And I have a few myself, but there's no agreed upon methodology to defining the last 50 years. Post civil rights, second Jim Crow. I mean, I don't know. It could be any of those. So we'll talk about that next week.